Eurasia, the world's largest landmass. Some 10,000 kilometers from the Pacific to the Atlantic Oceans. A formidable distance even in today's world. And yet over that vast distance, human beings have pursued one of history's greatest enterprises, the Silk Road. A tremendously profitable trade route, and so much more. For thousands of years, exotic goods, new technologies, conquering armies, and brilliant ideas traveled along the Silk Road. Silk Road trade helped to build empires and to break them. It fanned the fires of revolution, drove great explorations, and forged powerful bonds between faraway peoples.
The Silk Road made human beings realize that there are other people out there, and it opened the eyes of the East and the West.
This is the story of how Silk Road trade made so much more than money. It's the epic tale of how the Silk Road helped create a world that created us. Sometime in China's ancient past, some unknown person invented something new. By pounding plants until they fell apart, then boiling them in water, and then collecting the boiled plants on a screen and letting them dry, making what the ancient Chinese called refuse fiber, and what we know today as paper. An invention so influential that some believe the Silk Road should have been named for it.
I would call it the paper road because I think paper was far more important than silk, and that, silk is a very nice fabric, it's very strong, it's beautiful, lustrous, and stuff like that, but it didn't have the impact on world history, I would argue, that paper did. The Chinese believe that the court eunuch Cai Lun invented paper around the year 100 of the Common Era and started using it for writing then. Chinese archaeologists, however, have discovered examples of paper in the deserts of Western China that predate this by several centuries, perhaps 3 centuries or even more.
The Chinese probably first used the new invention as a wrapping material, while they kept writing the old-fashioned way, on strips of bamboo.
You can write so many characters on a strip of bamboo that's maybe 40 centimeters long or 12 inches. The problem is, if you want to write a novel, for example, or a long historical text, you need to have a whole pile of those bamboo strips and keep them together in order. So that becomes heavy. Paper, which is made from plant materials, from the cellulose in plants, can be made anywhere that plants grow. So you can make it virtually anywhere in the world out of virtually anything.
By the early centuries of the Common Era, China was using paper in all the ways we do now, even as facial tissue and toilet paper. And it wasn't long before it traveled west along the Silk Road. A journey that began as a pilgrimage.
Transformation of paper into a writing material came just at the time that Buddhism was introduced to China. The Buddhists of China were interested in finding the original writings about the Buddha and would travel to India to collect them. And so it's thought that the Chinese Buddhist monks and missionaries brought knowledge of paper and papermaking with them to India to collect these Buddhist scriptures and brought them back to China.
Chinese Buddhists traveled to India along the Silk Road, detouring around the Himalayas through China's western desert, and turning the Silk Road oasis of Dunhuang into a magnificent Buddhist library. In a desert without plants, Dunhuang monks made paper from rope and rags and copied thousands of Buddhist texts they brought from India. Thanks to Chinese Buddhism and to paper's obvious usefulness for keeping commercial accounts, papermaking began to spread throughout Asia.
As the Chinese then disseminated Buddhism throughout East Asia, they took knowledge of paper and papermaking to such places as Korea, Japan, Vietnam. We know that this is certainly before the time of the Muslim conquest of Central Asia, which occurred around the year 700.
In the 8th century CE, Arab armies fighting in the name of a new religion, Islam, thrust deep into Central Asia and clashed with Chinese forces. During the same century, the Arab world began making its own paper, something that's traditionally been explained with a story about an iconic victory of Arabs over Chinese.
The Battle of Talas was a battle that took place between Muslim forces and Chinese forces in Central Asia in 751. According to the historian Al-Tha'alabi, who lived something like 250 years after the event, he says that at this battle, Chinese papermakers were captured, and that is how Muslims learned about papermaking. It seems to me that this is a sort of nice but not terribly believable story. Why would papermakers have been in the Chinese army? It's not as if when you needed a sheet of paper, you then said, please make me a sheet of paper.
It's more likely that Arabs learned about paper by trading along the Silk Road and recognized its immense practical value. Middle Easterners could write on Egyptian papyrus, but they had to buy papyrus from Egypt. Paper they could make themselves. By the end of the 8th century, Arab papermaking was well underway.
The breakout moment for paper was when Muslim bureaucracy encountered it.
Those bureaucrats ran the Abbasid Caliphate, founded around 750 CE. From their capital in Baghdad, the Abbasids ruled the greatest empire of its day.
The administrators of the empire had responsibility to keep records about who was paid what, who owed what, who owned what, who had to do what. Less than a century of Muslims first encountering it in Central Asia, they're already making it in the capital of the empire.
And they quickly began using paper for more than keeping records. In 8th century Baghdad and across the Arab world, the availability of cheap paper made possible one of humanity's greatest literary eras.
Baghdad becomes a center of learning where books are written, books are translated from other languages. People wrote books on every possible subject, not only on words and the traditions of the Prophet, but also cookbooks, popular literature, science, astronomy, geography, translations of Greek books on mathematics, all sorts of subjects. And this explosion of learning has long been known, but it's never been appreciated that it was based on the availability of paper.
During the Middle Ages, an intellectual golden age flowered in Arab Spain. Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars collaborated to translate, teach, and preserve great works of science, mathematics, and philosophy.
One story about the library of the Cordovan Caliphate in Spain in the year 960 or 970 or something like that says that there were 400,000 books in the royal library. Now, that probably is an exaggeration. So let's take a zero off it and say that there were 40,000 books. But that is still more than 10 times the number of books that was in the largest university library in Europe several centuries later, because libraries in Europe were all on parchment, and the libraries in the Muslim world were on paper.
Spain was probably where Europeans first encountered paper. But Italian merchants were also discovering it through long-distance trade.
This is a time when Christian merchants from Europe, from such cities as Pisa and Genoa, Venice, are traveling to the cities of the Muslim world, such as Cairo and Damascus, in search of exotic items, goods like spices and silks. And they undoubtedly encountered paper. Our first European use of paper would have been by merchants who had seen Muslims using this stuff and must have brought it back.
But at first, many Europeans were suspicious of paper. It seemed so flimsy compared with parchment made from animal skins.
The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, for example, was familiar with paper, but didn't think much of its qualities for preservation or didn't know how long it would last. So he ordered all documents that had previously been copied on paper to be recopied onto parchment. Similarly, the abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, knew about paper, but said, oh, it was really disgusting that they made this stuff from vile materials rather than the pure reeds of the riverbed, meaning papyrus, or the skins of pure animals. And he was worried that paper could be made from dirty or unclean things.
But Europe's growing middle class was not concerned with paper's cleanliness. A single parchment book needed 200 animal skins and cost a fortune. And as it happened, geography had given Europeans the edge in mass-producing paper.
The rivers in the Middle East tended not to flow fast enough to create enough water power, whereas the greater variability in European terrain meant that you could harness the water power more efficiently to make more pulp more quickly. Europeans also had a ready supply of linen rags. In the late Middle Ages, a new way of processing linen had been developed using something called the flax breaker, which meant that there was a lot more linen being made from flax and made into people's underwear. Linen underwear was a lot more comfortable than woolen underwear because it didn't scratch. And so linen became very, very popular and became the source of rags for papering.
By the late Middle Ages, Italian hill towns like Fabriano and Amalfi had become Europe's leading paper manufacturers, shipping tons of paper to businessmen throughout Europe. And this mass production of cheap paper was changing Europe in other profound ways.
One of the most interesting documents that I've seen, or seen photographs of, is a poem by Petrarch, the Italian poet. It's on paper, and it is crossed out. He wrote out the poem, and then he changed his mind, and he put in a better word. So he was able to compose, in effect, on paper, as opposed to composing it in his mind, repeating it over and over again until he got it perfect, and then putting down a fair copy on the final expensive material. This is something you wouldn't do on parchment because it was too expensive. You'd have to scrape it off. Paper allowed all sorts of new ways of doing things. It seems to me that it's no accident that the art of drawing really develops in the 15th century in Italy. Paper allowed an artist to actually do a drawing and work out an idea in front of his eyes and preserve it for later use, or to look at it and say, I'll change this, I'll change that, and save it and make a copy of the drawing. And we know that Michelangelo, for example, did drawings of his drawings or did drawings of other people's drawings. This wouldn't have been possible with parchment because it was too expensive to waste in this way.
Meanwhile, in Asia, the country that had given paper to the world had developed a technology that had turned book production from a laborious job for scribes into a standardized process: printing. In the 9th century CE, the time of the Tang dynasty, Chinese printers were printing book pages carved from a single block of wood. The world's oldest printed book is this Chinese copy of the Buddhist Diamond Sutra, printed in the year 868 CE. Some 400 years later, around 1300, Asian woodblock printing had traveled the Silk Road to the west. But by then, China had invented a more efficient way of printing. Instead of carving a single wooden block into a book page, printers engraved pieces of clay with individual Chinese characters, baked the clay letters to harden them, and then arranged them in a frame to create a book page. The earliest known use of movable type. And then, in the year 1440, Johannes Gutenberg, a goldsmith in the German city of Mainz, came up with a new way of printing. Gutenberg began with a screw press, a wooden screw that pushed a plate down on a flat surface. Invented by the Romans to make wine, and used in Gutenberg's time to make woodblock prints. He made his own movable type by punching letters out of metal and casting them using a hand mold he'd invented himself. He devised a system for quickly composing lines of type in trays. And he invented a new oil-based printing ink that transferred easily to metal type. Gutenberg's new printing process was much faster and more efficient than Asian printing techniques. But its biggest advantage may simply have been this: the Latin alphabet.
In Chinese, you have many characters, and so you have to have like 6,000 individual characters in order to print something. In Europe, where you have the Latin alphabet with individual letters that are not connected to each other, and you only have 26 of them, and you have uppercase and lowercase, capital letters and small letters, you don't really need that many to write out a text.
If ever a new technology rewrote human history, it was Gutenberg's printing press. Within a few years of Gutenberg's first printing run, millions of Europeans were reading the Bible and other best-selling books translated into their own languages. Something we take for granted, but in 15th century Europe, it was revolutionary. Working together, paper and the printing press had achieved something never done before. They had democratized knowledge.
Man muss sagen, wenn Gutenberg den Buchdruck nicht erfunden hätte, dann hätte ihn vermutlich jemand anderer erfunden. Denn zu diesem Zeitpunkt war es so, dass es eine riesengroße Nachfrage nach schriftlichen Texten gab. 1000 Jahre lang hatte es gereicht, dass in den Klöstern Mönche mit der Hand Texte vervielfältigt hatten. Aber das System war ja sozusagen eine Einbahnstraße. Der Papst konnte seine Informationen verteilen, aber die unten waren, konnten nicht nach oben ihre Informationen verteilen. Und dieses Bürgertum, was jetzt neu aufkam, die haben einen ganz neuen Markt geschaffen, wo sehr viel Schriftlichkeit gefragt war.
Europe's new demand for books and its new ability to mass-produce books to meet that demand would soon have enormous consequences. In Germany, a firebrand monk named Martin Luther wrote a list of 95 proposals for reforming what Luther denounced as the corrupt practices of the Catholic Church. Thanks to paper and the printing press, his ideas spread like wildfire across Germany and Switzerland. And so began the Protestant Reformation, a spiritual revolt that ended Catholicism's 1,000-year monopoly of the European soul. And some other best-selling books helped an Italian living in Spain realize his dream. His name was Cristobal Colon, and he was deeply disturbed that the holy cities of Christendom had fallen under the rule of the Ottoman Turks. Colon drew up plans for a new crusade to liberate Jerusalem. To fund it, he decided to travel to Asia to trade for spices and other luxury goods he could sell for a large profit back home. But the Ottoman Empire had blocked Europeans from the Silk Road. Colon needed to find a new route to Asia. His deep study of two books, the travels of Marco Polo and the ancient Greek author Ptolemy's geography, convinced him that he could find Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. And when he landed in the Americas in 1492, Colon, known to history as Christopher Columbus, was sure he'd found it. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1498 that the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope and sailed east to India, discovering the true sea route to Asia. But the New World Columbus had given Spain proved to have riches of its own. By the middle of the 16th century, the Portuguese had established good trading relations with China in Guangzhou and Macau. And Spain's American colonies were sending so much silver home that there was hardly any room to store it. Spain was sending it on to Northern Europe, especially the Netherlands, as payment for trade goods. Their pockets bursting with American silver, Europeans became addicted to two Asian luxuries. One was porcelain, an extraordinary ceramic, made by firing a soft white clay called kaolin at very high temperatures, well over 1,000 degrees Celsius. China had been making porcelain for export and trading it throughout Asia and the Middle East since at least the 9th century CE. In the 17th century, the Dutch captured 2 Portuguese ships filled with porcelain and held a giant porcelain auction. It was the beginning of Europe's 300-year obsession with Chinese ceramics, or as they became known in Europe and America, fine china.
It was a status symbol for the West, and they had never seen anything like that before. But also, they certainly didn't know how it was made.
Porcelain imports were indispensable to consuming another Chinese trade good craved by Europeans: tea. Like porcelain, tea had been a profitable Chinese export since at least the 9th century. To the Middle East, but not to Europe. The Portuguese began trading for it in the 16th century. In 1657, a London merchant sold the first tea in Britain. By the year 1700, tea drinking had become a British obsession. Heavily promoted by the British East India Company, which traded British textiles to China and needed a profitable luxury good to bring back to Britain. And as Chinese tea began moving west to Europe, Europeans began trading exotic new foods to China. In the 17th century, dozens of never-before-seen food crops from the Americas, potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, peanuts, pineapples, chilies, and tomatoes, began appearing in Chinese markets. Some of these new foods offered more than just the appeal of the exotic. Corn, potatoes, and sweet potatoes grew in harsh New World environments like the South American Andes. Chinese farmers soon discovered these hardy crops would survive the frequent droughts that wiped out many native crops, starving large numbers of Chinese. It's no coincidence that in the 17th century, after the introduction of drought-resistant crops, China's population began to grow. And kept growing until China became the world's most populous nation. And the new sea routes brought even more to China from the West. An Italian named Matteo Ricci arrived in China in 1582 and spent the rest of his life there. Ricci was a Catholic missionary, and his mission to China produced one of history's most enlightened meetings of minds. Ricci learned to speak, read, and write Chinese, and formed deep friendships with Chinese scholars. One of Matteo Ricci's closest collaborators and first converts to Catholicism was the mathematician Xu Guangqi.
My ancestor, Xu Guangqi, who is known in Vatican history as Paulo Siu, met him around the time when he first came to China. And in 1603, my ancestor converted to Roman Catholicism.
Working together, Matteo Ricci and Xu Guangqi translated works from the ancient Greek mathematician Euclid and other classics of Western science and mathematics into Chinese. They also translated Confucian writings into Latin. Ricci wrote to his superiors in Europe, asking them to send more missionaries to China, but only their smartest men. In China, he wrote, "We are dealing with a people both intelligent and learned."
Xu Guangqi himself was an astronomer, a highly accomplished astronomer, and a mathematician. But the introduction of Western science opened his eyes to a different way of thinking, a different way of approaching natural phenomena.
Matteo Ricci was a Jesuit, a member of the Society of Jesus, a new Catholic order founded on the principles of the European Renaissance. Jesuit priests were trained in science and mathematics, as well as in theology. As missionaries, they respected other cultures and worked to integrate Christianity with non-Christian beliefs. From the 16th until the 19th century, nearly 1,000 Jesuits worked in China, teaching everything from engineering to mathematics to geography, and sending back translated classics of Chinese learning to Europe, giving Europe its first in-depth knowledge of Chinese civilization, and China its first in-depth knowledge of the West. Chinese and Europeans became more and more fascinated with each other's civilizations. King Louis XIV of France sent French Jesuits to the mission in China. And Chinese emperors appointed Jesuits to important government positions. For more than 100 years, Jesuit astronomers directed the Imperial Astronomical Bureau. One of them, the German Johann Adam Charles von Bell, helped create a new Chinese calendar that predicted solar and lunar eclipses with more accuracy. He also introduced his Chinese colleagues to a new European invention, the telescope. The Belgian priest Ferdinand Verbiest built an aqueduct, made European-style cannons for the army, and built a steam-powered vehicle for the emperor, considered by some to be the world's earliest automobile. In 1674, Verbiest presented the emperor with a new map of the world. The collaborative product of European and Chinese knowledge, it was more than just a map. It was an expression of a new worldview. A worldview based on science, exploration, and confidence in the human ability to discover, to invent, and to create a better world. A worldview that saw the world as one.
Arguably, the most famous scholar of that age is Voltaire. And in his essay Sur le mur, which was first published in 1756, he argued that China was the paragon of enlightened monarchy, ruled by intellectuals. It challenges the fundamental notion that the Christian European world was the beginning and the center of civilization. China, in Voltaire's mind, was a civilization ruled by reason and ruled by men promoted through education, through virtue, and through their scholarly accomplishments, their merits, not by hereditary rights.
In Voltaire's time, Europeans were fighting their hereditary kings for the right to rule themselves. By 1800, political revolutions in Britain, America, and France had ended centuries of absolute monarchy. New technologies like the mechanical loom and the steam engine, and the rise of industrial capitalism were connecting the far corners of the world. And an ancient Chinese invention that had spread westward centuries earlier was playing a critical role. Gunpowder had made modern warfare possible. And in mineral-rich areas like France's Vosges Mountains, it was helping in a different way to create the modern world. At the beginning of the 17th century, these mountains were honeycombed with mines and crowded with miners from all over Europe, chasing rumors of riches underground.
On a dit qu'à tel endroit, il y avait de l'argent, donc l'ivoire. Et dans les Vosges, on a parlé au XVIe siècle de ruée vers l'argent. Il y a eu la ruée vers l'or aux États-Unis au XIXe, et en Europe, ici, c'était la ruée vers l'argent dans les Vosges au XVIe siècle.
In the accounting books of the Tio mine, archaeologists discovered an entry from the year 1617, recording the purchase of gunpowder to do something revolutionary: blast a mine tunnel from the living rock.
Alors, cette partie est assez extraordinaire parce que c'est ici que l'on peut voir les premières traces de l'utilisation de la poudre noire en mine, avec ces grands trous qui sont là sur la paroi et qui ont, avec un intervalle à peu près de 30-40 cm, fabriqué toute cette paroi à l'aide d'explosifs. Nous sommes dans les années 1620, certainement, et c'est une technique nouvelle qui est utilisée avec des outils nouveaux, selon un process qu'il a fallu inventer, puisqu'il n'existait pas de précédent. Cette technique a façonné la roche. Et les traces d'outils sont bien nettes. C'est un outil que nous venons de trouver en fouille également ces dernières semaines. C'est ceci, une curette. C'est un outil particulier qui est muni d'une petite cuillère à son extrémité d'un côté et qui de l'autre côté présente une ouverture, un chat, dans lequel on peut glisser un linge, un petit chiffon. L'utilité de cet outil, lorsque l'on réalise le trou avec le fleuret, c'est de progressivement évacuer dans le trou les déchets, la poussière, et de nettoyer le trou. Ensuite, l'autre extrémité est utile pour sécher le trou avant d'y mettre la poudre, parce que l'humidité et la poudre ne font pas bon ménage. Voilà. Donc c'est un outil qui continuera à être utilisé au XVIIIe siècle, sous cette même forme. Ça n'a pas, jusqu'au XIXe, c'est encore le même outil. Autre outil en fer trouvé récemment, c'est un vestige, un morceau d'une tige métallique qu'on appelle une épinglette, qui permet de avec ce dispositif, de guider la mèche, de prendre l'extrémité de la mèche et de la glisser le long de la cheville de tir jusqu'à la poudre. Dans la mesure où on ne peut pas glisser une mèche souple sur une telle longueur, sur un bois, dans un trou dans la roche. Il faut le guider. Donc pour guider la mèche, on a cet outil. Voilà, donc nous avons là les outils essentiels qui expliquent le process de l'utilisation de la poudre dans les débuts du XVIIe siècle.
By the beginning of the 19th century, gunpowder was helping European mining evolve from laborious hand digging to a modern enterprise, supplying Europe's growing industrial economy. And across the Atlantic, it was about to help a new nation unlock its vast economic potential. On July 4th, 1817, the United States of America's 41st birthday, crews in New York State began digging the Erie Canal, a nearly 600-kilometer shipping channel designed to connect the Great Lakes with the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean. So towns and farms on America's frontier could ship and sell their products worldwide. Most of the canal route lay in flat country, and the canal builders had little trouble digging through soft soil. But 50 kilometers from Lake Erie, the landscape suddenly changed.
By 1824, they got here to Lockport. And what they encountered was a solid rock ledge of a very hard rock called Lockport dolomite. 10 or 12 miles from here, there was more hard rock excavation than anywhere else in the canal system put together. This is the same rock that forms the lip of Niagara Falls. It's as if they were climbing the face of Niagara Falls in order to get canal boats past here and onto Lake Erie and the upper Great Lakes.
Lifting canal boats from Lockport to the level of Lake Erie meant raising them 15 meters high. The only way to do that was by building a series of locks. But cutting those locks through dolomite with picks and shovels would have been next to impossible.
You can chip away with chisels and picks, but it would have taken years and years and years to whittle down, to hew your way down through this rock. But without explosives, they weren't going any further. They weren't going to reach their ultimate goal of Lake Erie. They weren't going to be able to open the Great Lakes to maritime commerce. They needed some way to move massive quantities of rock.
Using gunpowder instead of pick and shovel, the canal builders excavated the lock chambers in 2 years. But gunpowder's work was just beginning. As soon as the canal diggers reached the height of Lake Erie, they had to lower the channel below it, so the lake would flow into the canal and keep it full of water.
Behind me, you're looking at the final challenge in Erie Canal construction. It's not terribly exciting looking. It's not like the locks, but this cutting the slot, the deep cut through 4 miles of rock, was the last major challenge before the canal builders could get to Lake Erie, and the one that took them more than a year to accomplish. The deep cut required them to cut a vertical slot through rock, something they hadn't encountered anywhere else on the entire canal construction project. They probably used more gunpowder, more explosives in these 4 or 5 miles than they used in the rest of the canal put together. Rock went all over the place. There are lots of stories about anything from a pebble to a boulder raining down on the construction camp. This hail of rock every time they set off a charge. And the blasting went on day and night. Construction workers were killed in blasting. There were residents of the city who were killed. There are newspaper accounts of women being killed by falling rock. while they were simply minding their business, walking from one house to another.
By the end of 1825, the deep cut was finished, and the Erie Canal was officially open for business. Before roads and railroads had penetrated the North American wilderness, the Erie Canal made possible the westward economic expansion of the young United States. And the digging of the Erie Canal had another enormous consequence. It would play a key role in transforming the American seaport at its eastern end into the modern world's greatest city.
The Erie Canal vaulted New York City from being one of several Atlantic ports, competing with Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston, to the head of the pack. New York became a world leader in maritime commerce and all the other business activities that go along with maritime commerce, things like insurance and financing and the grain exchange. That all happened in New York because the Erie Canal brought the produce of the interior of a continent to the Atlantic in New York Harbor.
By the 20th century, New York had become the prototype of the megacity. Spawned and sustained by global trade, the megacity transcends its national roots and becomes a world city, encompassing human diversity. New York's evolution was the ultimate expression of forces that have been at work for thousands of years. Set in motion and sustained by the east-west commerce of the Silk Road. A path through history that didn't just link human beings together, but shaped their fates.
The Silk Road was like a ray of light. It opened our eyes, east and west, to intangible ideas, to beautiful things, to beautiful thoughts.
Today, the ancient tale of the Silk Road seems like the story of an exotic past. But in fact, it's just as much a story of the future. 2 or 3 times a week, a train departs from the Chinese city of Erie. It's loaded with Chinese-manufactured consumer goods, and its route takes it across 6 countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. It takes 18 to 20 days to reach one of several destinations in Western Europe, over distances of some 12,000 to 13,000 kilometers. Loaded up with European-manufactured goods, it returns to China. The EU Railway is pioneering the return of the Silk Road. On 14 May 2017, China hosted a conference in Beijing to promote its One Belt, One Road initiative. Attending were delegates from around the world, including the heads of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations, and nearly 30 heads of state. Known as OBOR, One Belt, One Road plans to build a $1 trillion transport network that will connect some 60 countries, 2/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of the world's GDP. Inspired by the old Silk Road, it will re-establish the ancient trade routes overland and by sea. And it will also create a new Silk Road in space. On August 1st, 2017, China's Tianzhou-1 cargo spacecraft released the nanosatellite Silk Road 101 CubeSat into orbit. Silk Road 1 is a pathfinder for a constellation of around 30 satellites operating across a variety of wavelengths. These satellites will help build an efficient and reliable satellite navigation system that will provide mapping and navigation services and remote sensing technology to all the cities of Western China and to other countries along the new Silk Road.
空间的高位置意味着它可以为全球的联系提供一个非常独特的、非常有优势的一个连接的方式。通信卫星是一个典型，对地观测也是高位置的一个很重要的这个典型。2020年是完成空间站的一个基本的建造，建造完了以后，我们将运行的空间站也根据这个需要，还不断的扩展它的这个应用的范围。
这个也是希望能够通过我们的空间站，能去带动整个的这个人类航天的发展，那么起到一个负责任大国的这么一个目的。这样的话呢，经过发布之后，将来我想会有更多的国家会参与到我们的空间站的建设以及将来的这种实验以及成果的转化。
“一带一路”使得这个各国，对吧？能够共享发展成果，共同推进人类的这个人类文明共同体的这个建设。那么这个空间的独特优势，一定会在这个“一带一路”的这个建设中发挥它的作用。
For thousands of years, the movement of goods, people, and inventions across Eurasia has played a critical role in shaping human destiny. And it may soon be helping to shape humanity's future.